And I'd like to introduce Dr. Terry Richmond, who is the Andrea B. Laporte Professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and she'll be hosting our moderating our next session.
So we have three panelists, and each of us will have about 10 minutes, you know the drill, and then we'll have questions and answers. I'll start us off talking about the impact of firearm violence on youth, families, and communities. I'm followed by Dr. Joel Fein, who's a professor of pediatrics and emergency medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and the co-director of Center for the Study and Prevention of Violence at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And finally, Greg Dorfman, who's the supervising attorney of the Gang and Gun Prosecution Section with the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, and he serves as the Gun Violence Prevention Coordinator. So Greg is one of our stakeholders, so we have a really rich panel here, and are thrilled to be talking about this. So I'm going to give you a snapshot of a few things. And since I come from Philadelphia, let me just first say, I'm a FACTS Consortium member, hence FACTS, and I also sort of bring the Penn Injury Science Center with me, which I have to acknowledge, where I serve as Research Corps Director. Thanks, Joel. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'm going to start with, when we think about the impact of firearm injury on individuals and communities, 2006, 10 Amish schoolgirls were shot in their schoolhouse. 5 died, 5 survived. Can you think of a less likely place for firearm violence to rear its ugly head? But as awful as that is, when you look at the deadliest mass shootings over the past 70 years, it doesn't even rise to fit in this chart. So that is a phenomenally sad statement. We talked about Sandy Hook earlier today, and I had that highlighted in red. For many people, that was a wake-up call. We didn't wake up quite enough, but just terrible. We hear in the media school shootings all the time. Sounds like our biggest problem, and it's a huge problem, but it's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is really the daily toll of firearm violence on youth, families, and communities. If we fast forward to the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida, and that was in 2018. If we think about that, we didn't make tremendous progress from Sandy Hook. The impact is huge, and it got in front of our face again. But on that same day, this is the trauma alert screen from the number of gunshot wounds that we saw in the same 24 hours in one hospital of multiple trauma centers in one city in the United States. So the biggest toll when we think about the consequences of firearm violence is the daily toll to children, adolescents, parents, and communities. FACTS Consortium members did a scoping review looking at long-term consequences, and the bottom line is we don't know a lot, and we need to know a lot more. And we also know from that scoping review that that almost 45% of the articles were about mass shootings, but we're seeing the toll every single day in our communities. I'm going to talk about a few things. This is from a series of studies funded by the CDC, so thank you, Deb, to Youth Violence Center. And we think about the consequences on child well-being. This is a paper about community violence exposure. 95% of kids hear, and this is 10 to 16-year-olds, by the way, 95% hear about community violence, 87% witness it. Over half directly victimized, and of that group, victimized more than once. You can say community violence or pervasive violence is not the same as firearm violence. Well, it was in this sample because every narrative had to do with a gun and every exposure had to do with a gun. So we followed up with these youths with a series of qualitative interviews and about their strategies for staying safe and how they coped with the violence in their communities. It was all about guns. A little boy got shot around the corner. Where can I go? The swimming pool area is fine. The basketball part, for the most part, is all right. It's just late at night when games are going on, little fights break out. You know, just a few times shootings happen. And yet this is in a Philadelphia recreation center under the auspices of the city of Philadelphia, where kids can go to play, to be safe. And, you know, shots happen. So when we talk about community violence exposure, in this sample in low-resource urban Philadelphia, it's all about guns. This is the rec center that our kids primarily played at. This is where we had all our community meetings with our community partners. 6 injured in a shooting at a Philadelphia Rec League basketball game. So this is what these kids are exposed to. And when we think about the consequences of that and the problems with that, what we found is what we call constant vigilance. The antenna were always up with these kids, always up. And you could say, well, it's good to be vigilant. It's good to be sensitive to your environment. It's good to decide, oh, I'm going to walk this way or not this way, or I'm going to really keep my eye out for something. But that constant vigilance, if you go back to sort of allostatic load and the toll that that has on development of children, it was really tremendously problematic. And we know from the literature all the things that are associated with that constant vigilance and that allostatic load. What are the ripple effects if we think about the consequences and the long-term consequences of firearm violence? Well, let's think about family well-being. So children don't live in isolation. They live within the context of families. This is a paper, and you're going to say, what does this have to do with firearm violence? This is a paper that my community partner, which was a Housing Plus agency, nonprofit in Philadelphia, asked us to answer a question. They took low-resource, housing unstable, single-parent families and provide subsidized housing with the expectation that the parents work part-time to pay for the subsidized housing and that they pursue educational degree. So, and you say, well, it's not kids' education. But if we think the way to health is through getting rid of poverty, and the way to get out of poverty is education, this was critical. What we found in a very complex analytic approach, it was not any individual factor about the parent, it was where the housing unit happened to be located. So in 100 and some housing units in a 2-mile radius in West Philadelphia, we had high variations in crime. And in this case, if you happen to be placed in a housing unit, high crime, which was primarily firearm violence, you were less likely to accrue educational credit. That affects child well-being if the parent can get out of poverty. While that's somewhat depressing, this got a lot of press, this paper, and what we found was you can change people's lives block by block by block, change the environment to improve the health. Family well-being, why did people not accrue educational credits? Because of the gunshots outside of their houses. They were scared to leave their children. They were scared to leave their children even with another caretaker. There are drugs in the area, and the shooting happens day or night. It was bad this summer. Parents held children captive in their homes. So what does that do to the health and well-being of children? The social well-being. So this is Philadelphia school system. We talked about this earlier, and the use of metal detectors in schools. And I love this paper. When do you have weapons is heard more often in schools than do you have dreams. And this girl comes into the school, and she holds up her weapon, which was a book. And we have a school system where there's not enough books for kids, and schools are closed right now for asbestos exposure. So where our resources go is directly impacting the health and well-being of children. And just think beyond the bullets. So as I come to a close, what I really want to make the case of is, yes, it's terrible to have a bullet in your body, the kinetic energy, the physical damage that it does, but the damage is so much broader even when you're not shot. So I come back to how I think about this. Remember, for those of you, I have white hairs, and some of you do, or some of you don't have any hair. I'm looking at you, Steve. I'm sorry, Steve. And remember when the AIDS epidemic, and we started having universal precautions. We consider all blood and body fluids to put us at risk, not just that you're at risk, but you're not at risk. We instituted universal precautions. So as I close and hand this over to Joel, I say we need to redefine what universal precautions are. And universal precautions for kids who live in violent areas exposed to guns and firearm violence, we need to consider all individuals to have experienced trauma, either in the immediate or the distant past, and manage them clinically and build the research in that area in order to really help these children grow and develop. And with that note, I'm going to hand it over to Joel.
Thank you, Terry. And Terry was one of the directors of the research core for our Violence Prevention Center, and we had community members as other directors of that core, and it really was an amazing group of people, and the work has continued since then. I really appreciate being here. I'm so excited by the stuff I'm hearing, and I have to slow myself down a little bit because when I get home, I'll have the rest of the stuff to do. But the amount of research and studies that are getting done right now and need to get done is truly overwhelming. I have one disclosure from the NICHD, which is our study on preventing post-traumatic stress in kids who are violently injured. I wanted to start by talking about, some of you who've worked with us on the health system's approach to violence has seen this infographic. And it is basically a way of saying what has been said already, which by both Dr. Bowman and Dr. Mahomes, which is that we need a multidisciplinary approach to violence. There is, we've heard that there's not one solution, there's not one sector that's going to be working on this. In general, the health system, including public health schools, public health departments, and hospitals as anchor institutions, are a verifiable leader in this, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this area, which is emergency departments and hospitals, because that's where I live and that's where I work. These are what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, and I think when we think about how do we break this cycle, and there's a little broken cycle down here, we think about what we can do in the hospital with things that Dr. Carter was talking about and Dr. Cunningham and their group with Dr. Walton do, but also how do we assure immediate safety for our patients and clients when they come in? And what does it mean to be trauma-informed about when Dr. Betis mentioned taking what we know and moving it into what we do. Oftentimes what we talk about in our center is how do you actually do trauma-informed care? What does it mean? Everyone says we should do it. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. As Dr. Richmond mentioned, trauma-informed effectively means, and if you have to put it into an elevator speech in one floor, consider how previous experiences influence perceptions and reactions to the care that we provide. And to promote that culture of safety, we need to not only be aware of the effects of trauma, which is now Trauma 101 being taught in every institution for the most part, which is a different world than we lived in 15 years ago. Understand what those signs and symptoms of being triggered are, and most importantly, stop re-traumatizing our patients. And the way that we do our work in the community and in the hospital is to avoid, most importantly, to avoid re-traumatization. And then, of course, we can move this up to policy as we find what's right to do. So here's some examples. So person comes into our emergency department, a kid, say it's a teenager. The things that we have to do to make them whole in that emergency department and prevent them from feeling like this is not the place where you can make a connection or engage them is, number one, to provide that feeling of connection to us. And we have one person who's dedicated to staying with that person. If it's the family member or a person with that family, that's what we do. Help remain calm. I hope none of you have ever been in a trauma bay, but if you have, you're staring up at 15 different people who are basically masked and gowned, so it's your worst nightmare come true. And then there's noise and triggers, and then we don't even make them feel safe at that point because they're getting stuck with needles and things that hurt them. So helping them feel safe and reassuring them of what we're doing is part of what we have to do, but they are in the safest place right now, and making sure that whatever control we can give them, and we do this with kids all the time. Which ear would you like me to look in first? Not, can I look in your ears? right? But it's the same thing for teenagers and adults. It's the same approach. Giving people as much control as possible gives them a sense that you're working with them and not at them. The other thing I want to mention is having security stand by the door of a trauma bay when someone feels like they've done something wrong is actually a trigger for many of our clients. And then, of course, telling them what to expect. If you want more on this, there's an article that was published. Kyle Fisher was the first author of this, and I can send it to you. The second is, how do we break the cycle using intensive community case management? And we've heard about some ER versions of work that can be done, and very successfully, with motivational interviewing and work that's done in the emergency department and soon thereafter. The work, what I'm going to talk about is our hospital-based violence intervention programs, and many of you in the room have actually come to our conferences and actually know this a lot more deeply than others. But what we do is we reduce traumatic stress. We work with supporting the patients through the systems, the multitude of navigation that has to happen to heal from an event is truly takes a team approach to work with DHS and education and all the things I'm about to talk about. So that team starts in the emergency department here with a social worker, maybe, and a clinician, and maybe a crisis worker from one of these programs. If we can't catch them in the hospital, because, as Patrick mentioned, 80% of them leave before we can get to them, then we assign a case manager, maybe a community health worker, and certainly hook them up with a mental health professional. This takes work. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes money, and it takes a lot of patience, no pun intended. There is an evidence for this. Much of that evidence is actually, that research has been done in the adult or a general emergency department, and you can see these are the studies that we say we can reduce return to medical care and injury recidivism if we do this correctly, with maybe one exception in a study that Mike Abatanas did. But in general, the consensus and meta-analyses would show that this does work. But for kids, the research still has to be done. We have to learn how to do this for kids. And when we think about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, when we see a kid who's been assault injured in our emergency department, not necessarily a gunshot, we call that tertiary prevention because they've been injured already. But what that actually is for firearm injury, it's primary or secondary prevention, because we know that that kid is the very high risk for coming back with a gunshot or involved with firearm injury, or, as a case with a recent client of ours, sitting by the door with a gun waiting for the kids who beat him up to come back again and kill him. And we actually our program wound up moving that child to a different city because he had so much post-traumatic stress he couldn't live in the same city. Our CHOP Violence Emergency Department, when we recruit them from the emergency department, believe it or not, 50% of the patients that are seen in our emergency department that are violently injured are females, because most are non-penetrating injuries. Most happen around the school, either coming, going to, or in and around school. And we see about 75 to 100 people a year with their siblings and families. One of the things I wanted to talk about is we, together with the family, identify what needs you have for healing from this event and every other event that's happened to you. And on this slide, you can see that more than half of them say that they would like mental health. This is very contrary to what we would assume. 89% of our African-American males in our program put mental health as a priority. We published that data because it was so surprising to us. And all of these other support systems that they were requesting. Remember, for kids, public benefits, substance use, others are not as high priority because they're younger and they don't experience those issues. Because we provide the services that you see here, and this is happening over months in the community with the families, we are able to resolve most of the needs of our clients. 70% of those needs are resolved. 72% of mental health needs versus 11% nationally of kids who get connected to mental health care who need it. 100% of child protective service needs and safety needs, almost 100% of safety needs. And so with that amount of work, it takes a lot of work, but it actually does change that trajectory from that child to a kid that can actually thrive and not have firearm injury in their lives on a personal basis. So to end, we do have a best practice guide on how to start a program, and we've had many, many meetings around this, and this is one of them, and I promise Rebecca that I am not sleeping. I'm just thinking about what she's saying, and then Nanine Carricker is the first author for this. Yes. We both look the same, don't we? So I wanted to move our talk then from the health system to the next system, which is the law enforcement system. We all play a role in this, and I would like to pass this on. And Greg, it's up to you. Okay.
Good afternoon. So I want to talk about prosecutorial practices that relate to gun violence prevention, focusing on family and children. But I think the point that I want to make is the purpose of the presentation is not to really delve into too much detail on what we do on a daily basis, but more to show you what we do with the research that you guys come up with. I've worked very closely with the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy with researchers such as Garen and Shannon, who's here today, to develop some of our policies and protocols in our office that focus on gun violence prevention. The other thing, too, I think that's really important about prosecutors focusing on prevention. Most of our work is always reactive. By focusing on prevention, if we can stop the crime from occurring to begin with, then we get away from the incarceration issues, right? It's not always about putting people in jail. Can we do something to stop the crime in the first place? So around 6 years ago, my elected boss came to me and he said, Greg, start a gun violence prevention program in the office. And it got me thinking, what is my role as a prosecutor? What can I do? What can I not do? And thinking about it, prosecutors have a lot of power, but we operate within the confines of the Constitution and confines of the law. And we have very high ethical standards too, right? But we have a lot of power to do some things. We have power to put people in jail. We have power to put people in prison. We also have the power to prevent crime. And that's what got me thinking. When we look at gun cases like the ones that are up here, as prosecutors, somebody comes before us. If they use the gun during the course and commission of the crime, we're super hyper-focused on the gun itself because that's what's going to lead to the punishment. But what happens in a case such as domestic violence where there is no gun used and we have our horse blinders on and we don't realize that we're releasing a defendant back into the house, back into the home, and he or she is going to have access to a firearm. We don't think about that because the gun wasn't used in the course and the commission of the crime. So our typical case is going to be somebody gets arrested, we file a criminal case against them, and more likely than not, they're going to be released from custody because we have bail reform. And the majority of our cases are not going to be the homicide cases or the assaults with great bodily injury. The majority of the cases are going to be lower level, let's talk about domestic violence, but lower level DV cases where the injury is not so great that it's going to require somebody to be jailed during the pendency of the trial. So they walk into court and they're going to walk out of court. And traditionally all we do is we serve them with a piece of paper that's a criminal protective order. And we say, you know what? Stay 100 yards away from the victim, and by the way, if you have any guns, you have to turn them in. That happens day in, day out throughout this country. It's been like that for decades. But what has not happened is that we have not stopped to realize that we are sending these people back into the homes where there are probably guns, or there may be guns. And that piece of paper, that protective order, is not going to do anything to protect the victim. We know that. In fact, probably that moment in time that we serve that protective order and then send the person back into the home is probably going to be the time where we're putting our victim most at risk. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so it got me thinking about the research that's out there and the statistics. And it's very sobering, and I've seen it firsthand. I know that people, ER docs who treat patients, prosecutors who have to deal with gun violence cases day in, day out, police officers, people who are exposed to gun violence, it's not just the victim, but it's also the people who are working on the issue as well. And I started becoming really engrossed in the stats and super hyper-focused on the crime guns inside the house, and in particular domestic violence and storage cases. For a little bit of time, I sat on the Los Angeles County Juvenile Suicide Review Team. I saw a couple cases where we had 10, 11-year-olds who gained access to unsecured firearms and killed themselves, and I couldn't take it. I have 2 children of my own, and so I quit that because I couldn't handle it. We had, in my career early on, 2 misdemeanor domestic violence cases that after releasing the defendant, they went back and murdered the victim. And so it's very sobering, but it leads us to a place where we can come up with some sort of solution. And I come up with this recipe for prevention, and it looks really childish, this little checklist. We don't operate based on charts and statistics. We have to operate on super simple checklists because, for example, in my office, there's 500 attorneys. And it's not just me implementing a program, but it's getting the buy-off from the deputies who actually have to go into court day in and day out and follow a protocol. So here's the checklist. It's 4 prongs. I learned that if it's more than 5, no one's going to do it. So number 1, identify the who and the what. Who are we going to be focusing on, and what type of cases are we going to be looking at? We have to have knowledge. We have to know whether or not the defendant has access to a firearm. Number 3, we have to identify whether or not the person is prohibited. And then 4, most important, is the mechanism for removal, which has been missing historically in prosecutors' offices. So the who and the what, we've adopted a risk-based approach. And we do it because, and you can see this is the consortium's report from 2013, we do it because it gives us legitimacy. It takes us out of the subjective into the objective. So when we go to court, we can tell the judge, this is why we're focusing on this particular defendant, because he is most at risk to commit another act of gun violence or to commit a future act of gun violence. And we're also going to look at the cases that are going to be, quote unquote, the lower level cases, because these are going to be the defendants who are going to be immediately released. These are not people that are going to prison for 10, 25, or life. So our risk individuals are going to be the violent misdemeanors, the DV restraining orders, the alcohol and substance abuse, and then I'm putting in another category, the negligent storage cases. But let's talk about the DV. I really want to focus on that because it's the guns in the house that really cause me concern. So we have to identify what the prohibitions are. And we have 2 categories. We have the prohibitions that are created within the life of our criminal case and the prohibitions that are created outside the criminal case. Within the criminal case, we have to divide it up into 2 subcategories. And those are going to be prohibitions that are created prior to conviction and those after conviction. And as prosecutors, we should be focusing on the first 2 on the left, which are the pretrial prohibitions, because that is the moment in time, the earliest moment in time, that we're going to be able to get the firearms lawfully out of the house. And those 2 pre-conviction prohibitions are going to be the protective order, and then also in jurisdictions where there maybe won't be a protective order, or cases like alcohol, narcotics abuse, where we're not going to have a victim, we can have judicially created prohibitions, where judge basically just has to say, I'm going to let you out of jail, but as a condition, you can't have a gun. And then post-conviction, obviously, there's certain enumerated crimes that create a prohibition, and then people who are put on probation can have what's called weapons conditions. We also focus on the prohibitions that take place outside the criminal case, such as civil restraining orders, gun violence restraining orders, or ERPOs, and also the mental health 72-hour holds, which in California create a 5-year ban. And the reason why we look at the prohibitions outside is because what I'm teaching the prosecutors in my office is every single case that comes in front of you where we have a person who is at risk of committing a crime of future gun violence, look to see if they're prohibited, or is there anything we could do lawfully to make them a prohibited person. So that leads us into the mechanism for removal. Taking all of our ingredients and putting them here, we have to have our knowledge. Is how do we know if the person has a gun? In California, it's easier for us because we have a state database of registered firearms, but it doesn't mean in other jurisdictions throughout the country that you can't find out whether or not a person has a firearm. That can be done through law enforcement investigations or also using the power of the judge, which is if the judge is going to release somebody on recognizance or on bail, the judge should be able to ask, do you have access to a firearm in the house? Otherwise, you're going to stay in custody. So we have our knowledge, we have our prohibition, and then we have to have the mechanism for removal. And this is what's been missing. Prior to my boss taking office 6 years ago, we prosecute over 10,000 domestic violence cases a year in my office. And I can't remember one case where we as prosecutors effectuated the judge's removal order. And that's something that we have to do, and that's something we can be doing. In California, again, we're lucky because we have mandatory compliance hearings. Turn your gun in within 24 hours, come back to court within 48 hours. But not all jurisdictions are like California. We're lucky in that respect. But there's other ways to do it. I've gone across the country and spoken to DA's offices and told them you don't have to have statutory compliance hearings. Again, use the judge. They have the power to effectuate the removal as long as you're there to help enforce it. Search conditions as a condition of release or a condition of probation, or search warrants. That's the other way to get inside the house. But the point is we can't have empty judicial orders. They have to be effectuated. I put up here it is possible. My point is that you don't have to be in California to implement these sort of robust protocols. And in our jurisdiction, we have recovered over 800 firearms from misdemeanor DV abusers, which is a lot. And hopefully we've saved a life in doing so. Two last things really quick. Safe storage. The picture on the left actually came from one of my cases. This was a defendant who was prosecuted for misdemeanor domestic violence, was served with a protective order. And remember, going back to knowledge, we went into our state database. We found a record that the defendant had one firearm. California Department of Justice door knocked. They went inside the house, and this is what they found. So not only was he a prohibited person because of the domestic violence case, all these guns were unsecured, every single last one of them, and the ammunition and the large cap magazines. So safe storage is important for two reasons. One is for protection of the people inside the house, especially the children. But also in Los Angeles, there's research that's come out of UC Irvine by a researcher named George Tita, who has told us that the majority of crime guns in Los Angeles come from home burglaries. Okay, so if you're not going to store your gun properly because maybe you don't have kids in the house or you believe it's not going to happen to you, store it properly because these guns are going to end up on the street if somebody breaks into the house. Lastly, as prosecutors, we should be thinking outside the box. You see the slide on the right. This is a pilot program in our office that deals with children exposed to violence. We have an area in South Los Angeles that's 2 square miles that last year had 98 shots fired calls. And so what we have done is we have created a team of trauma-informed prosecutors, law enforcement, and therapists that go into the community within 24 hours of every shots fired call, hoping to provide services to children because we know what's going to happen when children are continuously exposed to violence. And so we're hoping to break that cycle. So I appreciate being invited to this meeting here, but not just to share what I've done, but also because I take the research and I try and implement it. So thank you very much.
Okay, some questions. First, we'll start off with a broad one. How can we mitigate the impact of pervasive community violence on youth?
Easy first.
No, it's not an easy thing to mitigate the impact of violence. I was just talking about this with my colleague, Ruth Abaya, back there, because she is going to talk to a WHYY, which is our NPR station, about the 11-month-old and 2-year-old that just got killed in Philadelphia a few days ago. I think that the issue really is where kids are connected and where they become connected. If it's where they're in schools and homes, at rec centers, we need to make sure that we recognize when that child needs more help, but in general, they need to have positive youth development activities and then a informed group of people, whether that's community members or specialists, so to speak, in terms of professionals, to recognize when kids need more traumatic stress therapy. And that's not being done right now in schools, rec centers, or hospitals for that matter. The kids that live in our communities all need something, but some of them are showing more signs or more symptoms. And I think that we have to build up that system to find them and kind of protect them from the future risk. And I think Terry's been doing research on traumatic stress in young men, and so she probably wants to. I didn't plan this.
I'm going to move upstream a little bit. I have to say I've been on the Federal Advisory Committee for Healthy People 2030 National Objectives 4 years, and I'm speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for the committee, just so we're all clear, but it's all about upstream determinants. So the best way to mitigate the effects is to stop the violence in communities. And we know the social, the physical, the economic environment, the tremendous disparities. Philadelphia, for example, is the most impoverished of the top 10 cities in the country. We have got to move upstream and equalize resources available to kids and families and the communities in which they live if we want to stop it. And that actually is the best way to mitigate it. And you're going to see that all over Healthy People 2030.
Great. How can researchers and prosecutors work together to implement gun violence prevention strategies?
So Adeline is in the room, and the Educational Fund has done a really good job reaching out to prosecutors and collaborating with prosecutors and pushing the research to us. And I think it's important that we find ways to continue that sort of collaboration and communication. And then also finding progressive elected prosecutors throughout the country to work with as pilot projects.
Can I just add to that? So from a researcher perspective, I totally agree with what you say. And we worked for years, and Charlie, I'm looking at you because we were all in this together with the Southeastern Pennsylvania District U.S. Attorney's Office in terms of really looking at how they were managing firearm violence from a federal perspective, but within their catchment area. What we brought to the table as researchers, how we could really help them think about it and look at communities that really needed that kind of involvement. So we have to really be willing to build bridges with people. Often in healthcare, we say multidisciplinary is you're a surgeon, you're a pediatrician, you're whatever, and now I'm a nurse, so bring me into that. But we have got to build bridges so far beyond that in terms of all the other people who touch that problem in the community. And as researchers, we have to step up to the plate and be willing to do that.
Great. Okay, so what happens to the guns that are confiscated? Where are they kept and are they returned?
So I can just speak only to California. If the guns are kept, okay, so I'm in Los Angeles, and it's LAPD, and so LAPD has the facilities to store tons and tons of guns. So other jurisdictions, it's an issue in terms of how guns are stored, what condition the guns are kept in, et cetera, because eventually, if a person, depending on the prohibition, they are going to be able to apply to get their gun back. In California, if the gun was recovered by law enforcement, the person who's prohibited has to apply through Department of Justice and basically go through a new background check to make sure that they're now able to own a gun again. If they get that clearance from Department of Justice, they go back to the law enforcement and the guns will get returned. So it depends on the prohibition. Also, not to get too complicated, but depending on the charge that they're convicted of, if it's a statutory nuisance, the gun is going to be ordered destroyed by the court. And so it's our practice in my office that anytime we get a conviction on a gun charge, we always ask the gun be destroyed. It's always a condition of probation. If somebody wants a new gun, they're going to have to go out and buy a new one. But we're not going to return the crime gun.
If they're convicted.
Correct, if they're convicted, yes.
Great. And another question related to that, given this idea that relinquishment may play to people's fears, how do we work on the sales pitch around relinquishment? What data or information do you provide to people to inform them around this prevention strategy?
So I don't know if I'm best to answer that question. So in terms of relinquishment, we're following the law, right? There's a statute that says if you're served with a protective order, you have to turn your guns in, and we're just enforcing that. And I don't know if we ever stop to really think about what the messaging is to the defendant. We're just enforcing the law.
Great.
I think it's also, we see people who want to get rid of guns in their homes, right, for any variety of reasons. And it's like, how do you really get rid of a gun? And if I get rid of it, do I have to give it to the police? Or are there other safer ways to do that? We're having some discussions about that right now in terms of could a health system be the central point of voluntarily removing guns, and what are the issues with that, and how do we think through that? I mean, it's sort of an interesting thing because many people that we interact with don't want to go to the police to get rid of a gun. So how do we do that safely?
And what is your opinion on ERPOs?
Well,
you know what,
so
actually, that may be better for our next
Sure.
panel.
okay,
Okay, I have another.
because we
well,
do have
we
some
We have some opinions. Okay.
an opinion about it.
So the next question is about police shootings. Police shootings and police violence disproportionately impact communities of color. How do you see gun violence perpetrated by the police fitting into your research agendas? And what steps should our field be taking to reduce or eliminate the police violence in our communities?
I mean, we do have a number of kids who we interact with on, in our program where the injury itself was through being arrested and not necessarily through the actual event that led to that arrest. And we still accept them in our program. And what we hear from them is that they, in general, once they're past the anger, they actually do realize that they're, just like people are good and bad, there are people that do their job well and people that don't. And I think it's a matter of having that conversation with them, because they can never necessarily forgive the person that hurt them, but they can actually understand that there is some gray area there. And I can tell you that from just conversations I've had with the kids. From a policy level, I am not sure how that translates, but I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts on that.
I'm going to take that out more broadly in terms of the intersection of law enforcement. I'm looking at you, Eleanor. The intersection between law enforcement providers and healthcare at the point in the emergency department and trauma resuscitation areas, which I'm in an adult center, so I can only really speak from that perspective. But Eleanor Kaufman, who just raised your hand, since I'm led us on a lovely study in terms of people's perception of trauma resuscitation and the experiences of patients and their perceptions of police in the emergency department. And then another study with a colleague, Sarah Jacoby and Dan Helena and I, in social science and medicine, looked at the intersection between racism, law enforcement, and healthcare provision. And it's really, really problematic. In Philadelphia, for example, we have a policy that you can just put people in the back of police cars and transport them to the emergency department, and it gives entree. So we see sort of a tremendous mistrust of police in our city. Is this an accurate statement? In our city. They're in our healthcare space while we're trying to get a medical history and trying to resuscitate. They're asking detailed questions about what went on. And I think we see a loss of trust across the board in terms of not just mistrust of police, whether it's justified or not, but also of healthcare providers. And we don't really have policies in place. This is a policy issue of what that intersection should look like in the healthcare thing. So we wrote a health affairs blog. Sarah Jacoby led that, about that in terms of what professional society should think about as we think about this intersection.
So I want to thank you for those comments, and I want to add just one more thought as we think about this as a field, and I hear the question also being asked, how does this play into sort of our larger research agenda? And I think those of you who pick up a copy of the research agenda that we have out at the registration desk do see that we have questions that are in there around the intersection of police violence and youth victims. In terms of a field of study, I don't think we've begun to scratch the surface here. I can't ever look past, like, with the events of a single past weekend before we can find an example. Last weekend was the example of the woman who was shot in her home while sitting on the couch playing video games with her nephew. And she was Black and a gun owner. And so, the risks of carrying while Black, the risks of racism and the intersection of violence and guns is a deep area that needs a lot more questions and a lot more examination. And it's absolutely part of and should be part of an agenda of firearm violence and how we reduce firearm injury and death among kids. We have an awful lot of work to do and a lot of hard questions to ask. And so with that, I think I will thank the panel so much.